Over the summer, I traveled to La Mision, Baja, California to help build up the community. The organization I went with, Be to Live, has been taking 6 trips of about 50 people every year for 7 years. For 3 years, I have traveled with Phil and Mindy Steiner, owners of Be to Live, down to La Mision to help the community at the instruction of Door of Faith Orphanage and Open Arms Daycare. This year started like any other. During the first week of July, some people who would be going on the trip facilitated a parking lot fundraiser to help pay for their trips. The money that we paid to go to Mexico covered travel expenses as well as the food and the place we were going to stay. After that fair week, we were more excited than ever. A few months later, we were ready to go. The group boarded a plane at San Francisco International Airport to San Diego. From there, we got in vans and drove across the California-Mexico border, and right away we could see a change. Instead of the high-rise buildings and paved roads in San Diego, we were met with dirt and one-story buildings. Over the years, the area right next to the border has become more commercialized. But as soon as we drove for about 3 minutes, we started to see how different Mexico is from the United States. For one, all that anyone can see when they look to the U.S. is a giant white 15-foot fence blocking people from coming into the United States. A good ways away from the new fence, which was built in 2006, stands the old fence. The original border fence isn't that protective of the U.S. and allows migrant workers easy access into America. As we kept driving, we came across a giant concrete ditch with a lot of people in it. Phil, who was driving our van, told us that the people in the ditch were deportees from America, but they were not necessarily from Mexico. Many of the immigrants who got deported to Mexico can be from Honduras, Venezuela, Guatemala, or any other Latin American country. As we left the area near the border, everything became more desolate. We started to see homes that were made of scraps of anything that these people could get their hands on. We also saw buildings that were unfinished. We were told that when America sneezes, Mexico catches pneumonia. We also came across a figure called Grande Jesus. This had been the dream of Gregorio Ramirez and was finished in 2006. This is seen as a unifying figure for the people of Mexico, as well as a symbol of hope that things will get better. After driving for about an hour and a half, we stopped at Open Arms Daycare, run by Daniel and Heidi, to get a quick tour. Open Arms is a no-cost daycare, something that Mexico does not have. Instead, while parents are at work, families who can't pay for school leave their kids at home, sometimes for days at a time so that they can't provide for their families. Open Arms makes it so that families can stay together and give kids ages 0 to 12 a safe place to be after school. For the families enrolled in the daycare program, the mothers of the 60-plus kids must take parenting classes as well as help out 1 day a week at the daycare so that they don't just receive but also learn how to give. Doing this allows their families to stay intact when they would normally be separated. But there are some families who aren't so lucky. Many people drop their kids off at orphanages because they don't have the money to take care of their children. Because there is no foster system in Mexico, many of the kids who are in orphanage have at least one living parent, but they don't have the means to take care of their children. We stayed at and worked with Door of Faith Orphanage, which has been run by DJ and Lynette for over 20 years. They are the biggest orphanage in Baja, California, giving a home to over 100 kids. They housed all 50 of us and helped us find jobs around the community to improve the lives of others. We were given a few projects to do. We had to finish one of the buildings we were staying in, as well as finish a house that multiple groups had started to build. This house was in town and was known to the locals as the Skittle House because of its bright green color. We were finishing a duplex for 2 women who worked at the daycare. One side was for Cindy, a 19-year-old mother of 2 whose husband had been killed in a drunk driving accident. The other side was for her sister-in-law, Gladys, who's 17. She married into a family of 4 boys from her husband's previous marriage. Our goal was to finish up the inside of the house and make the space ample for living, since they were currently living in a little pink shack with 15 people. We started by sanding the walls of the house to apply more mud. We worked on applying mud and sanding the interior for a few hours, and then got back in the vans for lunch at the daycare. For a week in Mexico, the daycare would be providing us with our lunches and dinners. After eating, we were able to spend more time with the kids playing in their classrooms and out on the yard. The first thing I noticed when I walked in was how happy they all were. They were making do with what they were given and not whining and asking for more. I also got to see some of the kids that had been at the daycare years before. Only seeing them once a year, it's really interesting to notice how much they have or haven't changed, or to see if they remember you. But before long we were back at the house. We continued to sand and mud as well as break up rocks in front of the house and digging a sewer line for the house. We left around 5 o'clock to go back to the orphanage and have some rest time. After dinner we saw what some of the people in our group had been doing. They had been facilitating an art project with the older kids at Open Arms. They noticed that the kids there were very excited to let their creative side show. The next day, we continued to work on the house, sanding and mudding as well as dumping rocks into a small ditch behind the house. After lunch, I stayed behind to work on an art project with 0 to 5-year-olds. We made small fields of flowers with everyone's hands. Their fingers were used to make the stems, and they used their whole hand for the flowers. Every time we would ask who was next, everyone would raise his or her hands. On our way to go create the art piece, we were trying to come up with something to write on our piece of artwork. We had had the idea of making a heart out of the hands before, but decided against it and put hearts in the middle of the flowers instead. We eventually came up with the saying, "Love grows with helping hands." That night, one of the leaders, Deb, and I painted hearts in the flowers and wrote, "Con las manos ayuden, el amor crezca." Throughout the week, we continued to work on the Skittle house and building we were staying in. In the Skittle house, we continued to work on the interior, spraying texture on the walls, creating a shower, and making bunk beds. Because it was Saturday, Gladys brought the boys over, and they decided to get in on the action. While we were screwing things together for the bunk beds, the boys came and helped us hold things in place. When we had one bed finished, we needed to cut out the other. A skill saw was brought up to start cutting the wood we were using. Because no one else had used a skill saw, I was one of the people who was cutting wood. We managed to cut all of the pieces for the other 2 bunk beds and had almost finished a second one by the time we were leaving. When we got back to Dofo, the group who had gone to the dump joined us. After dinner, DJ, the head of Door of Faith, came and talked to us about how he got started with his orphanage. A main piece of his story was that, when we are helping others, we feel the best we ever will. I find this to be true. Even though I didn't have any technology and was doing hard work, I felt happy. I realized that I was always happy on these trips because of the connections I was making and because of the good that it was doing other people. On our 5th day there, we continued to work at the Skittle house. Because the texture was dry, we put primer on the walls and got to finish the last bunk bed. Of course, we had to have a little bit of fun, so we went down to the beach, which was about a 5-minute drive from where we were staying. But our observations on the differences of Mexico did not stop. Families would be walking along the beach selling anything from candy to dresses to support themselves. When we got back from dinner, we found out that Cindy's mom, who had had stage 4 cancer, had passed away that day. For a family that had lost so much in a short span of time, this house we were working on was a blessing. On our last working day, I ventured to the Tijuana dump. About an hour drive from where we were staying, we went to give resources to people who lived there, but our decisions were not made at random. We gave food and other necessities to people who have been trying to get a job or have been a service to their communities, not the people who don't make an effort to better their lives. We went to 5 houses and got to hear these people's stories. One woman had terrible arthritis and couldn't clean up her living space, while another woman, Erica, decided to serve others because DJ and Lynette had served her. We also met Eva. She was a young woman with 4 kids who was living on her parents' property in the old dump. But she had to move soon and needed to find a place to live because her father was getting out of jail and was not going to be allowed to live in his house anymore. We prayed for all of the people we visited and went back to hear about the formation of the dump and how it became a community. When the dump was formed, people would travel to find metals and other substances people had thrown away that they could sell or give to the recycling center to make money. After the dump closed, the people who were living there didn't want to move, so they now commute a few hours to the active dump to make money for their families. We also got to talk with Martita and Javier, who had been our guides. Martita had been a crystal meth addict, but was 6 months sober. Many people on the dump become addicted to drugs because it is how some people pay their employees. This keeps them working because they are addicted to the drugs that they provide, but it makes it so that their lives go downhill. They have no money for any of the resources that they need. In contrast, Javier had been in jail. While he was in jail, he had learned to make flowers out of wire and yarn, as well as make wood carvings. He sold these to make money for his family. As we drove back, we discussed how influential these people were in their community and how well they were doing for their situation. After going to the dump, we went back to the Skittle house to see the progress that was made. We were amazed to see that the house was basically finished. The showers were done, bunk beds had been sanded, and paint had been added to every room. All that was missing were a few essential items. That afternoon, we prayed over the families who were being moved into that house and got to hand them the keys. As we left, the kids kept running around trying to get us to stay. We experienced the same sentiment when bringing supplies back to Open Arms and saying goodbye to the kids at Door of Faith. That evening, we were blessed to hear Daniel and Heidi's stories. Each of them had come from different backgrounds. Daniel had lived in an orphanage for most of his life, and when he turned 18, started to work there. Heidi had grown up in the Valley of California, gone to college, and had everything she could ask for, but there was one thing missing in her life: her focus on others. She always tells us that she had been the all-about-me girl, never thinking about what others wanted. She had come to Mexico to practice her Spanish, and ended up staying because she fell in love with the orphanage she was working at. There she met Daniel. They got married and decided that God had a different plan for them. So they packed up everything and went to La Mision and started their no-cost daycare with only $1. These stories are really inspiring and always make me want to be as motivated as they are. But even though I may not do something as big as Daniel and Heidi or DJ and Lynette, I know that I can help in anything that I do. These trips always inspire me to be a better person and make me want to serve others. I would like to thank Phil and Mindy Steiner for making this trip possible, Door of Faith Orphanage and Open Arms for letting us stay with them, giving us food, and facilitating the projects we worked on, Mrs. Levine for guiding me during my Rose project, Brian Tabor and Savannah Christie for extra pictures, and all of the other volunteers and leaders who went on this trip. Thank you.